The Amazon receives more rain than nearly any other place on Earth. 2.5 meters a year falls across most of the basin. In the wettest parts, the figure climbs to 4. Rivers swell 40 feet above their dry season banks. Forests stand in standing water for half the year. Frogs lay their eggs in the puddles between leaves 80 meters above the ground. In the Western imagination, the equation is simple. Tropical sun heats the ocean, moist air rises, air cools, rain falls. The rainforest exists because the rain exists. That equation is wrong by half. Roughly half of the rain that falls on the Amazon every year does not come from the ocean. It comes from the trees themselves. The 390 billion trees of the Amazon basin draw water up through their roots, push it through their trunks, and release it through pores on the underside of their leaves. Every day, they exhale somewhere near 20 billion tons of water vapor into the atmosphere above the canopy. This is more, by volume, than the Amazon River itself discharges into the Atlantic Ocean over the same 24 hours. The river you can see is smaller than the river of vapor moving above it. That vapor forms vast atmospheric currents, what scientists have come to call flying rivers. Pushed westward by the trade winds off the Atlantic, recharged each time it passes over more forest, the moisture is recycled 5 or 6 times before it reaches the Andes. There, blocked by a wall of mountains it cannot cross, it turns south. It rains on Bolivia, on Paraguay, on southern Brazil, on Argentina. The breadbasket of South America is watered, in large part, by a forest 1,000 miles to its north. The forest does not depend on the rain. The forest is the rain. Which raises a problem the science has been quietly working out for 40 years. If the trees make the rain, and the rain makes the trees, then there is some threshold below which the loop fails. Cut enough forest, and the system stops being able to keep itself wet. The remaining forest dries out. Trees die. Less vapor is released, less rain falls. More trees die. Several of the leading models now place that threshold at somewhere between 20 and 25% deforestation of the original basin. Roughly 17 to 25% has already been cleared. What happens to a self-sustaining system when the part doing the sustaining gets too small to do the job? What happens to 20% of the world's fresh water, a tenth of all the species on land, 400 billion trees, 3,000 river kilometers, 50 million people, and a continent's weather, when the engine that holds it all in place gives way? No one knows yet, but the question is no longer hypothetical. How does a forest become the cause of its own existence? And what does it mean to be alive in such a place? This is the Amazon. 5.5 million square kilometers of forest spread across 9 countries. A drainage basin almost as large as the contiguous United States. A river system that contains more than 1/5 of the planet's free-flowing fresh water, and a single trunk channel so wide that in places you cannot see one bank from the other. The river itself is not the longest. The Nile is longer by some measurements, the Mississippi, Missouri by others. But by volume of water carried, the Amazon is in a category of 1. It moves more water to the sea every second than the next 7 biggest rivers in the world combined. At its mouth, the freshwater outflow is so vast that it can be measured in the Atlantic 200 kilometers offshore, a brown plume bleeding into the blue. And yet what the world calls the Amazon is mostly not the river. It is the forest, the largest continuous tropical rainforest on Earth, home to roughly 40,000 plant species, 3,000 species of freshwater fish, 430 mammals, more than 1,000 kinds of bird, 400 reptiles. Around half the species in some of these categories exist nowhere else on the planet. It is also home to people, between 35 and 50 million of them, depending on how you draw the borders. Among them are over 400 distinct indigenous peoples speaking more than 300 languages. At least 100 groups in Brazil alone live in voluntary isolation, with no contact with the outside world. It is, by almost any honest measurement, the most biologically and culturally rich land surface on Earth. And it has been that way for a very long time. For 65 million years, through ice ages, through the rise and fall of mountain ranges, through climate shifts that erased other forests entirely, the Amazon has held. The flying rivers have kept turning. The trees have kept exhaling. The rain has kept falling. The change that is happening now is happening in roughly 50. In the central Amazon, where the basin's two largest tributaries finally meet, the river performs an unsettling trick. The Rio Negro flows down from the north, black water, stained the color of strong tea by the tannins of decomposing leaves in the forest above. The Solimões flows from the west, white-gray with the sediment it has carried down from the Andes. They meet just east of a city called Manaus, and they refuse to mix. For nearly 6 kilometers, the two rivers run side by side in a single channel, a clean line drawn on the surface, black on one side, ochre on the other. Different temperatures, different speeds, different densities. The boundary holds, visible from satellites overhead, until the river's velocities finally equalize and the waters begin, slowly, to dissolve into one another. The phenomenon is called the Encontro das Aguas, the meeting of waters. Below the line, the combined flow becomes what most maps simply label the Amazon River, though Brazilians are insistent that the proper Amazon does not begin until further downstream. Manaus itself sits on a low rise above the Negro, a city of more than 2 million people in the middle of a forest the size of Western Europe. There are no roads connecting it to the rest of Brazil. To arrive overland, you fly. To arrive by river, you take a boat from Belém, a journey of 4 to 5 days. In the wet season, parts of the city flood. The waterfront market sells river fish whose names have no English equivalent. Tambaqui, pirarucu, tucunaré. In the center of Manaus, behind a Baroque pink and white facade, stands the Teatro Amazonas, the Theater of the Amazon. It was built between 1884 and 1896, at the height of the rubber boom, with materials shipped from across the world. The roof tiles were made in Alsace. The marble for the staircases came from Carrara in Italy. The cast-iron walls were forged in Glasgow. The chandeliers were Murano glass. The opera house was meant to prove that wealth this far from anywhere could buy anything. The wealth was real. For a brief stretch of the late 19th century, Manaus was, per capita, one of the richest cities in the world. The fortunes were paid for by a single substance. The wealth was rubber. The rubber came from a tree. The tree, Hevea brasiliensis, grew nowhere on Earth in commercial quantities except this forest. The only way to extract it was to send people deep into the trees with knives and buckets, to slash the bark and bleed the latex out, drop by drop, tree by tree, hour after hour. The people who did the work mostly were not free. Beyond the city, beyond the river port lights, the forest carries on as it has done for 65 million years. The canopy reaches an average height of 40 meters. In some patches it climbs higher, 50, 60, occasionally 70 meters. Beneath it, 3 more vertical layers of life: the understory, the shrub layer, the forest floor, each with its own community of organisms specialized to live nowhere else. At the top of the food chain, almost invisible to anyone who is not looking for it, walks the largest cat in the Americas. The jaguar weighs between 56 and 120 kilograms. It is the 3rd largest cat on Earth, after the tiger and the lion. Its bite is proportionally the strongest of any big cat, strong enough to puncture the shell of a turtle or crush the skull of a caiman. It does not stalk in the open. It hunts at the edges of rivers, at twilight, alone. A single male's territory in the Amazon can cover more than 100 square kilometers. To indigenous peoples across the basin, the jaguar is not simply an animal. In the cosmologies of the Yanomami, the Ashaninka, the Tucano, the Desana, the jaguar is a being capable of moving between worlds, between the human and the spirit, and shamans across many traditions describe transforming into one. The Olmec carved its face into stone 3,000 years ago. The Maya used its pelt as the marker of kings. Today, the jaguar's range across the Amazon has shrunk by more than half from its historical extent. Roads, ranches, and fragmented forest have done what bullets could not. The cat is still here, but the forest it can move through is shrinking. To understand where the Amazon's water comes from, it helps to begin not at the mouth, but at the source, high in the Peruvian Andes, on a glacier called Nevado Mismi. A small spring emerges from melting ice at 5,000 meters of altitude. Water trickles over rocks, joins another stream, becomes a creek called the Apacheta, which becomes the Cahuasanta, which becomes the Apurimac, which becomes the Ine, which becomes the Tambo, which becomes the Ucayali, which finally, after 1,600 kilometers of falling, joins the Marañón to become what cartographers will agree to call the Amazon. But this is the river. The river is not what makes the basin wet. What makes the basin wet is the trade winds. They blow off the equatorial Atlantic, push moisture-saturated air over the Brazilian coast, and send it westward across the continent. As that air mass moves over the forest, it gathers a second cargo, the water vapor exhaled by the trees themselves. By the time the trade winds reach the Andes, between 60 and 70% of the moisture they carry has been picked up over land. When that air finally hits the wall of the mountains, it has nowhere left to go. It rises, it cools, it drops everything it has been carrying. The eastern slopes of the Andes are among the wettest places on Earth, not because the Pacific is anywhere near, but because the Atlantic, by the time its water arrives here, has been processed through 6 trillion leaves. The river that flows down off the mountains is, in a real sense, the same water the trees just released into the sky. "500 kilometers downstream from where the Marañón becomes the Amazon proper, the river passes a city of 500,000 people that has no road connecting it to the rest of the world. Iquitos is the largest city on the planet that you cannot drive to. It sits in the Peruvian Amazon, ringed by jungle on every side, accessible only by air or by boat. Its grid of streets, dating from the rubber boom, is laid out around a central plaza of European tiled buildings whose materials were shipped, like those of Manaus, from Portugal, Italy, and Germany. Out beyond the plaza, the city becomes Belém, a floating neighborhood of stilt houses and rafted shacks built on the river itself. In the wet season, the river rises by 10 meters and the residents move upstairs. In the dry, they descend. Children paddle to school in dugout canoes. In 1900, Iquitos exported nearly a quarter of the world's rubber. The mansions that lined its boulevards were built by men who had grown rich on the labor of the people whose forest they had taken. To understand who paid the bill for those mansions, you have to follow the river east, to the tributary that drains a corner of the basin that no one in Europe had heard of until 1910. The Putumayo River rises in the Colombian Andes and flows southeast for 1,600 kilometers before emptying into the Amazon. For most of its length, it forms the border between Peru and Colombia. In the early 20th century, that border was nothing more than a line on a map. The actual sovereignty along the river belonged to a single company, owned by a single man. Julio Cesar Arana was born in 1864 in the Peruvian town of Rioja. By his early 40s, he was the owner of the Peruvian Amazon Company, a London-listed enterprise whose business was the extraction of rubber from the Putumayo Basin and its export to Europe. The company controlled approximately 12,000 square miles of forest. To work it, Arana had organized a system that, in the words of the people who would later investigate it, was indistinguishable from slavery. The labor came from the indigenous peoples who lived along the rivers, the Huitoto, the Bora, the Andoque, the Okaina. They were not paid in money, they were advanced trade goods on credit at company prices that they could never repay through the rubber they were forced to deliver. Each worker was assigned a quota. Failure to meet the quota meant flogging. Repeated failure meant mutilation. Resistance meant death. The instruments of the system included an article of equipment so common at the company's stations that the workers had a name for it in their own languages. The whip was made of dried tapir hide and could strip skin from bone in 2 strokes. The company kept a stock of them at every outpost. In 1910, the British Foreign Office sent a man named Roger Casement to investigate the rumors that had been reaching Europe for several years. Casement was Irish, a career consul who had previously exposed the systematic torture and murder of rubber workers in the Belgian Congo. He arrived at the company's main station, La Chorrera, in September of that year. What he found? He documented over 13 months of interviews and travel through the basin. The company's overseers were systematically beating, starving, raping, and executing the people whose forest they were extracting. The labor force he saw bore the scars of beatings on nearly every visible inch of skin. The dead, he was told, had been numerous and recent. Casement's report, published in 1912 by the British Parliament as the Putumayo Blue Book, accused the company of a crime against humanity. The estimate that emerged from his investigation and from Walter Hardenberg's separate journalism was that approximately 30,000 indigenous people had been killed in the company's operations over the preceding 12 years. Other historians, working with later evidence, have placed the figure higher, at 50,000, 80,000, by some accounts as many as 100,000. In some Putumayo populations, the proportion lost reached 90%. The company collapsed within 2 years of the report's publication. Synthetic alternatives and Asian plantations had already begun to take rubber's market share. Arana himself was investigated, charged, and ultimately acquitted. He died in Lima in 1952, a comfortable old man. The bodies were never counted. The names were never recorded. The forest absorbed the camps, the stations, the ledges. What remains today along the Putumayo are scattered indigenous communities, some of them descendants of the people who survived, and the slow recovery of forest that had been bled for 30 years. Casement himself was hanged by the British government in 1916 for unrelated reasons, a charge of treason connected to his support for Irish independence. Among the items still in his pocket on the day of his execution was a notebook page with the names of children he had met in the Putumayo, written down so he would not forget them. Across the forest, beneath the noise of the canopy, another civilization works. The leafcutter ant is not large. A worker is the size of a grain of rice. But a single leafcutter colony can contain 8 million individuals, occupy a chamber system extending 6 meters underground, and process more vegetation per day than a fully grown deer. They are not eating the leaves. They are carrying them home in columns that may stretch 100 meters from the host tree to feed an underground fungus garden that the colony cultivates for food. The ants and the fungus cannot live without each other. Neither can survive in isolation. They have been farming each other for somewhere between 50 and 60 million years. In a single hectare of Amazon forest, the colonies of leafcutter ants together move more soil than any other animal in the basin, earthworms included. They aerate the ground, redistribute nutrients, prune the canopy in measurable amounts. The forest depends on them. They depend on the forest. Every acre that is cleared takes their farm with it. The species is older than most of the trees they cut. North of the Amazon's main channel, deep in the forests that straddle the border between Brazil and Venezuela, lives a people whose first sustained contact with the outside world began in the 1950s. The Yanomami number around 38,000 people, distributed across more than 250 villages spread over an area roughly the size of Portugal. Their territory was formally recognized by the Brazilian government in 1992 as the Yanomami Indigenous Land, the largest indigenous reserve in the country. Their language has no historical relatives. Their cosmology contains no gods in the Western sense, but a layered universe of named beings, Shapiri spirits that animate the forest and the sky. Their shamans speak with these beings while in deep trance, often induced by inhaled snuff made from the bark of a specific virola tree. The forest, in their understanding, is not a place. It is the body of the world. In 1987, gold was discovered on Yanomami land. Within 5 years, an estimated 40,000 illegal miners had crossed onto the territory. Mercury used in the gold extraction process poisoned the rivers. Diseases the Yanomami had no resistance to swept through the villages. By the early 90s, more than 15% of the Yanomami population was dead. In 1989, a young Yanomami shaman named Davi Kopanawa traveled to Europe and the United States to speak about what was happening to his people and his forest. He had no formal Western education. He spoke through a translator in Yanomami. The book he eventually published with the anthropologist Bruce Albert, titled The Falling Sky, has become one of the most influential indigenous texts of the past half-century. In it, Kopanawa describes a vision given to him by the Zapiri spirits, that the white world's hunger would eventually eat the sky itself, and the rain would stop, and the forest would burn. In 2023, after years of escalating illegal mining under the previous Brazilian government, the Yanomami territory was declared a humanitarian emergency. Hundreds of children had died of malnutrition. The mining had returned to its 1990s levels. "2,000 kilometers to the west, in the Brazilian state of Amazonas, lies a region of forest larger than Austria, the Vale do Javari. It is, according to the Brazilian Indigenous Agency, the place on Earth with the highest concentration of uncontacted human beings. At least 16 separate groups, perhaps more, live there in voluntary isolation. They have no contact with the outside world. Many have no immunity to common diseases. The Brazilian government, in principle, protects their right to remain unseen. In practice, illegal loggers, gold miners, and drug traffickers cross into the territory regularly. In 2022, the British journalist Dom Phillips and the Brazilian indigenous expert Bruno Pereira were murdered there while documenting one of the incursion routes. The people the killers were trying to keep hidden are still hidden. They live in a corner of the forest that has never appeared on a satellite image of the world they belong to. How they understand the rain, no one outside has been told. In the slow brown water of the Amazon, a creature surfaces and exhales, a long pink-gray back breaking the river for an instant before disappearing. The Amazon River dolphin, called boto in Portuguese and bufeo in Spanish, is the largest freshwater cetacean on Earth. Adults reach 2.5 meters in length. They are intensely intelligent, capable of echolocation in water so silty that vision is useless, and unique among dolphins in being able to swivel their necks, an adaptation for navigating flooded forests, where the river spreads sideways through the trees during the wet season and the dolphins swim between the trunks. In riverine indigenous tradition across much of the basin, the boto is not simply an animal, it is a shapeshifter. The story, told in different versions among the Tucano, the Marubo, the Bora, and many others, holds that on certain nights the male boto leaves the river, takes the form of a tall, handsome man dressed in white, and walks into village dances. By dawn, he must return. The children he leaves behind belong to neither world. The dolphin is endangered now. Mercury from gold mining accumulates in the fish it eats. Hydroelectric dams cut its territories in pieces. It is still here, but it surfaces less than it used to. At the eastern edge of the basin, where the Amazon finally meets the Atlantic, the river splits into a delta the size of Switzerland. The largest island in that delta is Marajo. It covers 40,000 square kilometers, slightly larger than the country of Belgium, and is home to about 500,000 people, 10 million water buffalo, and the remnants of one of the most underestimated civilizations of pre-Columbian South America. The Marajoara culture, which flourished here between roughly 400 and 1300 of the Common Era, built earthwork mounds, cultivated fields, produced ceramics of striking geometric sophistication, and managed an estimated population of more than 100,000 people in a place European archaeologists, until the late 20th century, had assumed was uninhabitable. Across the southern channel of the delta, on the mainland, lies Belém, a city of 2.5 million people that began as a Portuguese fort in 1616. It is hot, layered, and tropical in a way that few cities in the world manage. The Vero Peso market on the riverfront sells acai fruit, jambu leaves, tucupi sauce, dried piranhas, and bottles of dark forest oils brewed from plants whose names exist only in indigenous languages. In November 2025, Belém hosted COP30, the United Nations Climate Conference, at which the world's governments were asked to commit to keeping the Amazon below the deforestation threshold its scientists had identified. The result, depending on whom one asks, was either a meaningful step or a polite failure. The Amazon is not one river. It is a network of more than 1,000 tributaries, several of which would be among the largest rivers on Earth in any other watershed. The Tapajós, flowing north out of central Brazil, is the second largest of these. Its water runs clear, a blue-green ribbon distinct from the muddy main channel, and its course passes through the territory of the Munduruku people, whose ancestors fought the Portuguese for nearly a century before being absorbed into the colonial system. In the early 2010s, the Brazilian government proposed a series of major dams on the Tapajós. The Munduruku, organizing under a coalition of indigenous federations, blocked construction. The dams have, for now, been postponed. Further west, on the Xingu River, a different outcome was reached. Belo Monte, the world's third-largest hydroelectric dam by installed capacity, became operational in 2016 after 30 years of contested construction. To enable it, more than 100 kilometers of the Xingu was diverted into a new channel. The Big Bend of the original river, which had been home to indigenous fishing communities for thousands of years, was reduced to a fraction of its previous flow. The dam generates electricity for cities 1,000 kilometers away. The communities whose river was taken received compensation packages most of them have called inadequate. These are not isolated stories. There are, by current count, more than 400 existing or proposed hydroelectric dams in the Amazon basin. The rivers that have shaped the forest for 65 million years are, with increasing speed, being reshaped to deliver power to a continent that mostly does not live in the basin. In other places, what is being taken is something less visible. In Bolivia's Madidi National Park, a region recognized as one of the most biodiverse protected areas on Earth, gold mining has crept into watersheds the park was created to defend. In Guyana, the Kaiatua Falls drop a single uninterrupted curtain of water 226 meters deep in a forest the country has been told to log to service its debts. In Venezuela, the tabletop mountains of the Tepuis, flat-topped sandstone monoliths older than the breakup of Gondwana, rise out of the canopy like ships at sea in a region the state can no longer effectively patrol. In the Acre region of western Brazil, the forest along the highways shows two distinct shades from the air: the dark canopy of what remains and the bright pale green of the soybean fields and cattle pasture that have replaced what is gone. In each of these places, the same pressure is at work. The forest is worth more in any single year dead than alive. So far, that calculation has not changed. "40 meters above the ground, in the upper branches of a kapok tree, the largest forest raptor on the planet watches the canopy below. The harpy eagle has wings broader than those of any eagle on Earth, 1.5 meters in span or more, but they are short relative to the bird's size, designed not for soaring across open landscape, but for sudden, accelerating flight through the gaps between trees. Its talons are larger than the claws of a grizzly bear. They are capable of crushing the spine of a sloth or a howler monkey on impact, which is what they are evolved to do. A breeding pair holds a territory of around 50 square kilometers and produces a single chick every 2 to 3 years. The chick takes nearly a year to fledge and another year before it can hunt. Each pair, in other words, requires a vast and continuous patch of intact forest to sustain its slow reproductive cycle. When the forest is fragmented, broken into pieces too small to support enough prey, the harpies do not simply move. They stop breeding. The pairs persist for a while in the remaining patches, watching, and then, quietly, they are gone. In 1988, in a small town called Javari, in the western Brazilian state of Acre, a man named Francisco Alves Mendes Filho, known to everyone as Chico, was shot dead in the doorway of his own house. He was 44. He was a rubber tapper by trade, a seringueiro, the third generation of his family to make a living drawing latex from wild hevea trees in the Acre forest. He was also, by the time of his murder, the leader of an organized movement of seringueiros who had spent the previous decade resisting the conversion of their forest into cattle pasture. The method of resistance was simple and physical. When the bulldozers and chainsaw crews arrived, the rubber tappers and their families would link arms and stand in front of the trees. They called the practice an empate, a standoff. By the late 1980s, they had stopped enough deforestation in Acre to make Chico Mendes a problem for the ranchers who wanted the land. The men who ordered his killing were ranchers. The man who pulled the trigger was the son of a rancher. They were eventually convicted, served partial sentences, and were released. The forest Chico defended was, after his death, made into the Chico Mendes Extractive Reserve, the first of its kind in Brazil. It still exists. It is still inhabited by rubber tappers. Chico Mendes was the first internationally known environmental defender to be killed in the Amazon. He has not been the last. Between 2012 and 2024, more than 300 people were murdered in Brazil for defending forest land or indigenous territory. The number is conservative. It counts only the deaths that were officially documented. The deforestation Chico fought against in Acre has continued to expand across the southern and eastern Amazon. The pattern is consistent. A road is built, often in the name of national development. Settlers move in along the road. They clear small parcels of forest for farming. The small parcels fail. They are sold to ranchers, who consolidate them into pastures. The pastures, in turn, are eventually sold to soy producers, who clear what little vegetation remains. The result is a band of cleared land that follows the highways like a wound. Seen from satellite, it forms what scientists call the arc of deforestation, a great curve sweeping from Maranhão through Pará, through Mato Grosso, and into the Bolivian lowlands. By the most recent measurements, the arc accounts for the great majority of the Amazon's total forest loss. In 2019, fires set deliberately to clear land along the arc burned at a rate that registered on satellites in real time. The smoke reached Sao Paulo, 2,000 kilometers to the south, on the afternoon of August 19th. The city went dark at 3 in the afternoon. The cars on the streets turned on their headlights. People photographed the sky on their phones, not understanding what they were seeing. What they were seeing was the forest leaving. What they were not yet seeing, but would soon, was what the forest's leaving would do to the rain it had been making for them all along. In a research office in the city of São José dos Campos, a Brazilian climatologist named Carlos Nobre has spent 40 years modeling the question that the rest of his country is now being forced to confront. Nobre, born in 1951, was among the first generation of South American scientists trained on the new climate models that came out of MIT and the Hadley Center in the 1980s. The questions he chose to apply them to were local. What would happen, he asked, if the Amazon kept losing forest? At what point would the loss become self-sustaining? Where exactly was the threshold? The first answers he and his collaborators produced, a paper in 1991, refined in the years following, placed the tipping point at around 40% deforestation under conditions of stable global temperature. As the temperature rose, the threshold dropped. By 2018, in a paper co-authored with the late ecologist Tom Lovejoy, Nobre had revised the estimate downward. The new figure was 20 to 25%, under conditions of 2 degrees of global warming, which the world is now on track to exceed. Roughly 17 to 20% of the original Amazon basin has now been deforested. Another 5 to 7% is degraded, meaning it is still technically forest, but the canopy has been disturbed enough that the trees no longer perform their normal water cycling. The arithmetic is unforgiving. By the most conservative estimates, the basin is somewhere within 5 percentage points of the threshold. By less conservative estimates, parts of it have already crossed. The mechanism that Nobre and his brother Antonio, also a leading Amazonian climatologist, have devoted their careers to documenting goes by a name that has become familiar in the climate literature only in the last 20 years: the biotic pump. The pump is, in essence, a continent-scale machine made of living trees. As trees transpire, the air above them cools. Cool air sinks. Sinking air pulls in air from elsewhere, including, crucially, from the ocean. The transpiration of the forest, in other words, does not simply add water to the atmosphere. It actively pulls in more. The implication, formalized by the Russian physicists Anastasia Makarieva and Viktor Gorshkov in 2007, and elaborated by Nobre and others since, is that forests do not exist because of rain. Rain exists because of forests. Take away the forest, and the rain does not simply diminish in proportion. The pump itself stops. The continent dries faster than the trees were ever cleared. Several lines of evidence now suggest that, in parts of the Amazon, the pump has already begun to fail. The southern and eastern Amazon, the parts most affected by the arc of deforestation, have become, since approximately 2019, a net source of carbon dioxide rather than a sink. For the first time in the history of measurement, those parts of the forest are releasing more carbon to the atmosphere than they absorb. The dry season in the same region has lengthened by roughly 5 weeks compared to 40 years ago. Tree mortality, especially among large trees, has risen sharply. These are not predictions of what may happen. They are observations of what has happened. In 2014 and 2015, a drought of unprecedented severity hit southeastern Brazil. The Cantareira Reservoir system, which supplies drinking water to São Paulo, a metropolitan region of more than 20 million people, fell to less than 5% of capacity. The city came within weeks of having to ration water household by household. Climatologists who reconstructed the meteorology of the drought traced its proximate cause to a high-pressure ridge over the South Atlantic that prevented the usual flying river moisture from reaching the southeast. The deeper cause was, in part, that there had been less moisture in the flying rivers to begin with. The forest, 2,000 kilometers to the north, had stopped producing it in the volumes it once had. The drought ended. The reservoirs refilled. The lesson did not quite land. By 2024, southeastern Brazil was in the middle of another, longer drought, the worst in 70 years of records. What scientists like Carlos Nobre have been trying to communicate in increasingly direct language is that the question facing the Amazon is no longer whether the system can survive an ongoing perturbation. The system is, by every available measurement, already perturbed. The question is whether what remains can pull the cycle back together, or whether the loss will compound. If the forest crosses the tipping point, the modeling suggests that somewhere between 50 and 70% of the basin will, over the following several decades, transition from rainforest to a drier, more open ecosystem dominated by grasses and scattered fire-resistant trees. The carbon released would amount to somewhere on the order of 200 billion tons, roughly 5 years of total current global emissions, added to an atmosphere that is already too warm. The new ecosystem would not be a wasteland. Savannas are not wastelands, but it would not be the Amazon. The animals adapted to closed canopy rainforest, the harpies, the jaguars, the tens of thousands of species found nowhere else, would not survive in it. The indigenous nations, whose languages and cosmologies are built around forest, would lose, in less than a generation, the place that made them. The flying rivers would diminish. The continent would dry out. No single act of human will is going to bring the system back across the threshold once it has crossed. What is at stake in the question of the Amazon is not, at the end, simply the loss of a forest. It is the loss of a piece of the planet's regulatory machinery, a piece whose function we have only recently begun to understand, and which we are dismantling in real time, mostly without meaning to. The cattle pastures cleared from the southern Amazon in 1985 do not look like a decision about the climate of Sao Paulo. The gold mines along the Yanomami rivers do not look like a decision about the rain that falls on Buenos Aires. The soy fields in Mato Grosso do not look, from the cab of the tractor, like a decision about whether 200 billion tons of carbon are going to remain in the trees or be returned to the sky. But that is what they are. In a clearing somewhere in the Bolivian lowlands, a flash of metallic blue moves across a beam of sunlight. The blue morpho is, depending on the species, the size of a child's outstretched hand. The blue is not pigment. The wings contain no blue color at all. The hue comes from the microscopic structure of the wing scales, which refract light at a wavelength humans see as the most saturated blue in nature. From above in flight, the wings appear and disappear with each beat, visible, then invisible, then visible again. The morpho's adult life lasts only a few weeks. Most of its existence is spent as a caterpillar, eating leaves of specific host plants in the understory. It is one of more than 4,000 butterfly species recorded in the Amazon. It belongs nowhere else on Earth. It has been doing this in this place for a very long time. The Amazon is not a place that resolves easily into a story. It is too large for that, too varied. There is no single character whose life sums it up, no single event that defines it, no single landscape that, once seen, lets a viewer say they have understood it. It is a continent inside a continent, and like any continent, it contains everything: cities and emptinesses, gods and infrastructure, cathedrals and theaters, rubber barons and rubber tappers, scientists and shamans, jaguars and ants, 2.5 million people in Manaus, and 17 people in a Mashco hunting camp who have never met one of them. What the Amazon has, unlike most other places, is a single thread that runs through every part of it. It is the same thread the Yanomami shaman names when he describes the falling sky. The same thread Carlos Nobre identifies when he draws the mathematics of the biotic pump on a whiteboard. The same thread the rubber tappers recognized when they linked arms in front of the bulldozers in Acre. The same thread, written in its oldest indigenous languages, that says the trees and the rain are one thing. What is being decided in the Amazon right now is not, in the end, the fate of a forest. It is what happens when a complete and self-sustaining piece of the planet, older than nearly every continent in its current configuration, meets an industrial economy that does not have the conceptual vocabulary to recognize what it is dismantling. The dismantling has been going on for 50 years. The understanding of what was being dismantled has been catching up for 20. No one knows yet whether the understanding will arrive in time. It may. The deforestation rate in Brazil dropped by half between 2022 and 2024. International pressure is greater than it has ever been. Indigenous-led territorial defense against extraordinary odds has held back industrial extraction across vast areas of the basin. There are people, named and unnamed, in 9 countries who are working, often at the cost of their lives, to keep this place intact. There are also other forces at higher levels of organization and with deeper pockets working in the other direction. Both things are true. The forest is not gone. It is also not safe. What is being decided in the next 20 years is which of those two truths will, at the end, be the one that holds. The trees, for now, are still exhaling. The flying rivers, for now, are still flowing west. The rain, for now, is still falling on the leaves of forests it created. The pump is still running. Whether it will run for another century, or whether the people alive on this continent now will be the last to see it doing what it has done since long before any of us were here to ask the question, depends on choices that will not be made by the forest. They will be made by us. Thank you for spending this time with us in the Amazon. If you found something here worth holding on to, please consider subscribing. There are more places to walk through together,